For 4 centuries, Black Americans and white Americans have lived under a story that said they were two separate peoples, divided by blood, biology, and birthright. Slavery was built on that story. So were the laws, the borders, the schools, the marriages, and the prisons that came after it. Entire systems were designed around the idea that the genetic distance between a Black American and a white American was vast, a chasm too wide to cross, too deep to question. But DNA does not lie. DNA does not forget. When scientists finally sat down and compared Black American DNA to white American DNA, allele by allele, chromosome by chromosome, what they found did not just challenge the story, it dismantled it. The results revealed something so unexpected that some researchers initially thought they had mixed up the samples. The genetic record told a story that history books had buried for generations. If you're curious about ancestry, genetics, or the truth hidden in our blood, subscribe. New documentaries every week. To understand what scientists found, you have to understand who was actually mixed and how. Before the first slave ship reached Jamestown in 1619, the populations that would become Black America and white America did not yet exist as we know them. The land that became the United States was about to receive millions of people from 2 completely different genetic continents. From Africa came the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Mandinka, the Akan, the Fon, the Bakongo, the Mbundu, the Wolof, and the Fulani, descendants of empires like Mali under Mansa Musa, Songhai, Benin, Congo, and Asante. From Europe came the British, the Scottish, the Irish, the Welsh, with later waves of Germans, Italians, Poles, and Eastern Europeans. The slave trade routed those African peoples with brutal precision. Senegambians went to the rice plantations of South Carolina and Georgia. The Bight of Benin fed Louisiana and the Caribbean sugar economy. West Central Africans, especially from Angola and Congo, were dispersed across the cotton belt deep south. 2.5 centuries of forced labor, plantation hierarchies, and laws written specifically to keep these populations apart. Those laws, nonetheless, could not stop what was happening in the genetic record. So when modern researchers began comparing Black American and white American DNA on a massive scale, they were not just running a curiosity test. They were testing the foundation of how the United States built itself. The question was simple, but the answer would touch every nerve of American history. How genetically different are these two populations actually? Is the so-called racial divide real at the level of the genome? Are there clear, clean genetic boundaries between Black Americans and white Americans, the way the laws of segregation always insisted there were? Or had something else been happening for 400 years, something the official record was never going to show? The data was waiting in millions of saliva samples, in academic studies spanning decades, in the genetic databases of the largest ancestry testing companies on Earth. And what it revealed was not what either side expected. The first finding hit researchers immediately. At the level of raw DNA, a Black American from Atlanta and a white American from Atlanta share more than 99% of their genome. Not as humans, broadly speaking. Every person on Earth shares about that much. But as neighbors, as fellow citizens, as people whose ancestors arrived in the same country during overlapping centuries, the genetic distance between them was tiny. Studies suggest that the genetic difference between a random Black American and a random white American can be smaller than the difference between 2 people from neighboring villages in Nigeria. Read that again. 2 Yoruba men born 20 miles apart in the same Nigerian state can carry more genetic variation between them than a Black American in Mississippi and a white American in Mississippi. The reason is simple but devastating. Africa contains the deepest genetic diversity on the planet because humanity itself originated there. Every population that left the African continent, including every European population that came to North America, carried only a slice of that diversity with them. So when you compare a Black American who descends from multiple African lineages to a white American who descends from a few European lineages, the African side of that comparison contains genetic depth, The European side simply does not. The result is paradoxical, almost philosophical. The two populations American society fought hardest to keep separate are, by the cold metrics of genetics, remarkably close. To grasp why this is true, picture humanity's genetic diversity as a bag containing 100 different colored marbles, each one representing a unique variation that emerged over hundreds of thousands of years inside the African continent. Now imagine a small group leaving Africa around 70,000 years ago. They reach into the bag and grab maybe 15 of those marbles. Those 15 are everything they will carry to Europe, to Asia, to the Americas, to Australia. No matter how those 15 later split into populations and accumulated their own minor variations, they will never have more diversity than what is still in the original bag. Africa is the source. Everywhere else is a sample. Now picture what happened in the United States. The descendants of the people in that original bag, Black Americans, arrived in the same country as the descendants of the small 15-marble offshoot, White Americans. Then 400 years passed. 400 years of plantation life, of forced labor, of segregation, of laws designed to keep the two genetic streams from mixing. 400 years of pretending the difference was vast. But DNA does not lie. DNA does not forget. The official record said one thing. The chromosomes said another. And what the chromosomes said is that those two streams had been crossing all along, in one direction far more than the other, in ways the country was not going to write down. Here is where the comparison turns from academic to deeply personal. When researchers measured the European DNA inside Black Americans, the average came back at roughly 20 to 25%. 1 in every 4 or 5 segments of a Black American's genome traces directly to Europe. But when researchers measured the African DNA inside White Americans, the average came back near 0. Not because mixing did not happen. It did, constantly. But because the laws of the United States, especially the so-called one-drop rule, made sure that any person with even a trace of detectable African ancestry was sorted into the Black category, regardless of how they looked or what their family history said. The asymmetry is not a coincidence. It is a record. It is the genetic ledger of slavery itself. The European DNA inside Black Americans did not arrive through romance or marriage. It arrived through enslavement, through plantation households where the women who worked had no legal right to refuse, where the men who owned them faced no consequences, and where the children born from that violence were born into bondage themselves. Slavery destroyed family records. Slavery replaced last names with the surnames of the enslavers. Slavery anglicized first names, forbade African languages, banned drums because they carried messages across distances, and erased ancestral lines on paper, deliberately and systematically. But the genome kept its receipts. What slavery tried to erase, the DNA preserved. DNA does not lie. DNA does not forget. The data became even more revealing the closer scientists looked. Studies suggest that the European DNA inside Black Americans is overwhelmingly British and Irish, with smaller contributions from Scottish, Welsh, and in certain regions, French and Iberian sources. Research indicates that around 70 to 75% of the European admixture in the Black American genome traces to the British Isles, reflecting the dominance of English colonists in early plantation America. Geographic patterns sharpen the picture further. Black Americans from Virginia and the Carolinas show the highest British admixture, often exceeding 25% of total ancestry, because these were the earliest and longest-running slave colonies. Black Americans from Louisiana show distinct French and Spanish signatures because of the colonial history of New Orleans, the Louisiana Purchase, and the Creole communities that developed there. Black Americans from Texas show small but measurable Mexican and Spanish admixture inherited from the years before 1836, when Texas was Mexican territory. South Carolina and Georgia carry concentrated Senegambia ancestry, Mandinka, Wolof, Fulani, because rice planters specifically targeted enslaved people from those regions for their agricultural expertise. Even certain genes tell the story. The sickle cell mutation, common in many Black Americans, evolved in West Africa as a shield against malaria. Salt retention genes that helped enslaved Africans survive the dehydrating conditions of the Middle Passage now correlate with higher rates of hypertension in their descendants today. Survival on a slave ship in 1750 became a cardiovascular risk factor in the present day. The body remembers everything. Step back from the percentages, and a much larger picture comes into focus. Race, as the United States has historically defined it, has almost no biological foundation. The categories that shaped slavery, segregation, redlining, and centuries of social policy were not drawn by genetics. They were drawn by power. Modern genomics has shown again and again that there are no clean genetic boundaries between Black Americans and white Americans, no genome deep frontier separating one race from another. What exists instead is a continuum, a record of every person who ever stepped onto a slave ship, every person who ever bought one, and every interaction, voluntary or violent, that followed. And yet the social consequences of those invented categories are not diminished by this finding. They are illuminated by it. The disparities in wealth, health, education, and opportunity that follow the color line in the United States are not products of biology. They are products of history. Genetics has finally caught up to what historians and sociologists have been saying for decades. There is no race written into the genome. There is only the long shadow of decisions human beings made, generation after generation, about who counted, who was counted, and whose ancestry was worth remembering. For 4 centuries, the story said Black Americans and white Americans were two different peoples. The DNA tells a different story. It says that one of those populations carries the inherited diversity of an entire continent. Yoruba kings, Mandinka scholars, Akan traders, Bakongo survivors, blended through forced migration into a genetic signature that exists nowhere else on Earth. It says that the other population carries the inherited memory of European migrations, in proportions that, for centuries, refused to acknowledge what was right next to them in the same country. It says that the two populations are far closer at the chromosome level than any law, any pulpit, any textbook ever admitted. And it says that the asymmetry of admixture between them is itself a historical document, written into the genome by every act of violence the official record tried to bury. Every Black American walks today with a history book written in their cells. Kings, queens, kingdoms, survivors, and one of the deepest genetic signatures the human species has produced. What slavery tried to erase, the DNA preserved. DNA does not lie. DNA does not forget. Even when names were stolen, even when languages were forbidden, even when family trees were burned, the body remembers.